On today's episode of PJ and the Beard, we're going to do another installment of the interview series, and the Beard is going to tell you who we have with us tonight in studio.
Yeah, this is pretty exciting because probably the creator-builder of my favorite overdrive pedal of all time. So, David Barber from Barber Electronics.
Ta-da!
Hi.
So, how's it going?
It's going well.
Good. So, we always start these interview series with like kind of how we're familiar with your company. So, I don't know that we came up with a date, but several years ago, and I'm thinking it's at least 15. I'm saying like 2004, 2005. I drove to your shop, which was in Maryland at the time.
Yeah, the latest that would have been about 2006. The latest, because I was out of there after that, different shop after that.
That's right in that area, and picked up the Barber Electronics direct drive right from you. And it was this one.
foolishly have to interject. He directly drove down there.
Right.
And there's a little bit more to that in a second.
If we're getting into that or not. So, pick that one up. Love that pedal so much later on. I found somebody selling this pedal, which is an earlier version of that.
Indeed, that is.
So we have two Barber Electronics direct drive. And the change was we moved.
Yep, and that LED moved because I had customers that said that the LED could be covered by their foot, and I won't put my foot in the frame for effect, when they were kind of hovering, waiting to turn the pedal on or off. And so they didn't know because their foot was obscuring the view. So because customers said move it, I moved it and put it up there between the lights, the knobs, because it made it easy to see from behind, rather than putting it in more of a, like, perfectly, with great symmetry, like in the center or something like that. Under those two knobs was better for that.
And then Pat, because he liked mine so much, picked up this one, and this is a little later. So we have a very early, kind of an early and a later.
So word of mouth works.
Yes.
That's awesome.
And then the other pedal we have of yours, and we'll talk about this more in a second too, is the tone press.
Yep.
So, which is the first
parallel compression device.
Right.
The technique existed, but there wasn't a device that made it happen. I don't think the word or the phrase parallel compression existed before that. I didn't know of it, and it was something I realized I couldn't sell something calling it a dry signal and a compressed signal brought together through a mixer to play through your guitar amp. That's not going to work. So I just needed a simple phrase. Yep.
Which is simply, I have a knob that I can bring my dry signal back into the...
It just means that it splits when the signal comes in to the compressor pedal. You have a dry side and you have a compressed side. They're independently processed, and then they're brought together at a mix amp, like a mixing console would have. And then that blend or mix knob allows you to decide how much completely dry, a mixture of dry and compressed, or completely compressed. So you can get a complete range of 100% of dry or compressed. Where I see that some of the people that built them later would only give you 50% of dry or something like that. I think it's a good thing to be able to have it. And at the time, I was thinking I had to give extra value. So in order to be able to give fully dry, I was thinking, well, if compression is not something that they want, they sure do love boost pedals. So it could be used as a boost pedal, or it could be used as a boost pedal with a little bit of compression, or all the way up. And at that point, the idea would be, well, compressors are popular, and it was in a price range that still would compete with anybody else's handmade compressor. So I thought, well, I have to win all the way across here. I've got the new device, and I've got a boost pedal, and I've got a compressor pedal, all available within one box.
It's a very nice pedal. So, you brought along with you tonight kind of the line right now, right?
I did.
So let's.
They're all off camera.
Not only is it an interview, it's almost like an unboxing for us.
Right.
Except I know what's in the boxes.
And we might not get to keep some or all of them.
So I'm excited. This is with the latest incarnation
Of the direct drive.
of the direct drive, and we'll hold this up, maybe get pictures of it at some point.
So that's a V4 at the time of the shooting. I'm sure by the time you guys have put it out, it'll be a V6 or V7. It'll be the latest version. But for the moment, this was the V4. And that's my own personal one, the only one that has silver graphics on it. So sorry about that. Just one. So that means it was a proof. It was a test enclosure that was sent to me by the company that makes just our boxes at some point, probably over 10 years ago. And I just never used it and just found it sitting on a shelf and thought, well, I'll make my V4 out of that. And so the new one has the addition of, it already had toggles, but now they're three-way toggles, each of them, instead of being two-way toggles. So the old two-way toggle for gain, which was right here, was low and high gain. Now it's low gain, high gain, and then in the middle you have like a 4-input vintage amp, like an old Marshall type of sound. It's got more grunt to it. It's a little bit more dynamic sounding. It's something that you both hear and feel. It's not just one or the other. And then the toggle on, I guess, which is the left, I'm behind it, that was our old harmonics control, got turned into a mid-range control. So you have like a forward mid-range in the middle, and then you have a little bit kind of a middle point of mid-range, and then not quite scoop, kind of flat off to the right. Now this used to be a harmonics control that gave you additional harmonics, so that's kind of the sound of distortion. And that was pulled on this, and then we went to a toggle on the compact versions.
Okay.
And so I noticed that most players really liked, as you have yours with washers under it, they like the harmonics position. They want to hear that extra bit. And so that was so common, I thought, well, I can find a position that everybody will like, kind of a preset position with that, and sacrifice having the ability to adjust harmonics for the ability to adjust mid-range, which seems way more popular and a lot easier to fit into a person's amplifier and guitar. That's, as a designer, that's what I don't know, is when somebody buys one of our pedals, I don't know what their guitar sounds like. I don't know what gauge pick or strings that they use. Right. I don't know how their amp's set up. And so the more I can give them the ability to manipulate EQ and gain ranges, depending on how they're going to use it, the more it has a likelihood of hitting the target for them. There's no perfect pedal. I don't make it and nobody does. So you just have to make it match a wide degree of audience.
And
on to the next one.
Yeah, I'll pull the next one out. So this is in the tone press, which we held up, the one that I have, which is probably pretty similar, but we were...
similar. This is the shiny knob model.
It's pretty cool to have the guy that makes these in your basement pulling the back off of your pedal to check and see what's in there. And so on this one, volume, blend, and sustain, you talked about that a little bit. What about the little switches up at the top? Can you give us just a quick rundown?
Me, they're kind of what I accidentally do all the time. So there's kind of subtlety switches is the way I tend to refer to them. And when I'm designing, they tend to sound like they're doing a lot more because I'm so kind of zoomed in on the sound at that moment. And so the one off to the left here is for attack. And that was something that a lot of people wanted. In my opinion, a pedal that has a blend control on it and you're using a decent amount of dry sound blended with it, the initial attack will be all blend, all that dry signal, just because it has enough amplitude in the instance when you're striking the string that the compressor is not really able to be the thing that it kind of pulls back, but because you have a dry signal right next to it, that signal overcomes it. So for the first moment you hear really a dry guitar. That's the moment where these attack knobs and things work. So this really comes into play when somebody's got the blend much more towards the compression side, in my opinion. But these are something that customers demanded, and the other people who built pedals who were using this similar parallel compression type of scheme that they started adding, so they'd have a different feature than we did. So it was important to put that on. I want to make sure I stay in the game and feel comfortable. So that's there. I usually recommend that people use it on the normal setting. If you're playing patterns that have very fast percussion to them and you want to make sure that it recovers in time for every bit of the percussion, that's the time when the fast one works best for me. The other one is just to add a little bit of top end. So it's kind of a brilliance or a presence control, and it is subtle. But when you're in a recording studio and an engineer adds compression to your signal, which they almost always will, even if a guitar player feels that compression is kind of a superfluous sound that they can't hear very well and they don't really understand why people have it, the engineer will understand why they have it, because they have to make it broadcast ready so that it doesn't jump in and out of the mix. When you add a bit of compression to a signal that has a lot of amplitude like that, it tends to trim the very front of the note a little, and that's a lot of times where the articulation is, where the highs are. So it sounds like your sound got darker. Just what happened is the front part of the note where all that attack happens has been brought down to a lower amplitude, into a more even amplitude with all the rest of the notes that you're playing. So this brings that high end back in a little teeny bit. The amount that I think most engineers would, they would usually just grab the top, wherever they have it set, 8 to 10K, which would bring still 2 and 4 with it in a lot of these shelving type EQs. And they would just notch it up like 2 or 3 dB, just enough that you can barely hear it. And that's all it is. If you go any more than that to try to make it a more overt effect, something that you hear every time, it blows the point of it, because then it's too bright. It's just too bright to use, and the front of house guy that you're working with on your live gig is going to tell you you're a little too bright. So it's meant to be subtle with that, and so that's my really long explanation of what those two toggle switches do.
Yeah, that's great because you're going to do
it unique. Yeah.
You're going to do it better than we're going to do it. Next. And I'm not as... So now we're getting out of the ones that I'm really familiar with, although I have watched demos on this one and am very interested in it.
I have a sales pitch for this one too.
Yes, let's do it.
So this is the Game Changer, and make sure it's in view there. And that's really, this is a pedal that came about as a culmination of many different pedals that we made earlier on and requests. So virtually everything that we make starts off as a pedal that either I had an idea for a sound I'd like to produce, and then I thought it had an audience. I make lots of stuff that nobody needs to hear. So, but this came about because I'd certainly had people that said, I want a low gain, like a truly low gain overdrive, that even when the drive is all the way up, it doesn't turn into a bit of a higher gain monster, but it's got, the low gain at the very bottom of the sweep. And that's what happened a lot of times. Guys that wanted low gain would either have to turn the gain or drive control all the way off and just turn up the volume on it and drive the amp, or they could just barely crack it open. And sometimes it sounds a little dull when the pedal is tuned into that to not really get that range. So I wanted to make sure that low gain was at least up till 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and that the last bit of getting slightly more like a vintage amp cranked up was only at the very top, kind of the way it is on those vintage amplifiers. So I made this pedal called the LTD. That was a low gain overdrive. And it was called the LTD because we had called the direct drive, and that sounded like a car theme or like, automotive industry kind of thing to me. So LTD was the Ford car, the Ford LTD, and this is more of the luxury ride. So I was thinking, okay, I'll do that. It was probably not considered a great car, but no, I did that anyway. And so after that came out, well, actually, I should back up a little bit. When I was bringing that together to make into a product, I made a lot of prototypes. And at that point, I was making some friends in the industry, and they would stop by the shop where I was designing the stuff, and they would say, "What's the latest? What are you working on?" I'll say, "This is the cool thing I'm working on now." And they'd say, "Can you put one together for me? Can I get one before it's a production model?" And I had at least 3 different models that I just had named like female names. So there'd be no 1, 2, 3 or anything like that to try to influence their opinion, because everyone picks one. And I let them hear them, and then they'd say, "Oh, I'd like, the Julia pedal or something like that, or Angela or something like that." And so I knew which model that was, and I'd make one for them. So after the LTD was out for a little while, people wanted a little bit more. Some customers would ask for a little bit more of a flat response, and I had some of these guys in the industry that were saying, "I've heard all the versions you made. I still like the special prototype that you made for me." And so I thought that all those prototypes that these guys from the industry were telling me about were the same. And so I got one of them back, made sure that I had the circuit correct, and brought out something called the Silver LTD. That had a very subtle tone control on it. The entire sweep barely did anything, but that was the idea. It was just, since most people are sweeping in an area that only covers, going from 12 o'clock to 2 o'clock or something like that, why not make the whole knob the sweet spot? So that got a lot of customers eventually saying, once I made that, "Hey, my tone knob doesn't work." So, yep, succeeded again. So
Killing it.
Yep. What I ended up doing was putting that Silver LTD out that had the subtle tone control, and some of my guys that were the industry guys were like, "It doesn't sound like mine." So eventually, one of the product guys for Paul Reed Smith Guitars, a guy named Jay Hayes, he had the one that he would always we joke, that was the special recipe. That was the one nobody had. He'd always swear that it was different than the Silver. And I thought, how could it be? And so he sent it back to have some work done on it. And sure enough, it was a different one. Then I remembered. It was like a light bulb, and I was like, oh no, there was another version. So that became the SR, the special recipe version. So there was 3 different versions of the low gain one. Once that came out, people loved it. They liked all the different versions, but the original LTD had a further forward mid-range. The Silver had a more subtle tone control and was a little bit more even sounding. It was kind of in between. And then the SR, special recipe, had a really flat response. So that means the EQ spectrum of your guitar, when you plug it into the pedal, or any pedal, usually changes a little bit. If your guitar sounds a certain way, you turn your pedal on, and now the mid-range comes forward, or the highs jump out, something like that. with the LTD-SR, the frequencies really didn't change their balance unless you use the tone knob to try to influence them on purpose. And it would come out so that right around 12 o'clock, it was the right EQ. And I always tried to do that with just the LTD series because of the type of EQ that it had. So then people wanted more gain. Even though we made those pedals specifically for low gain, they were like, we want this exact sound, but now we need gain. So since that was not really an LTD anymore, we called it the un-LTD or unlimited pedal. So that covered everything we needed. We had the LTD, the silver LTD, the LTD-SR, and the unlimited. And then everybody wanted compact pedals because all those pedals were this big. So this became giant.
Right.
Once pedals this big came out, these were those enormous pedals. And anytime when somebody would bring up our pedals online and say on a forum like the gear page or something like that, I like that pedal that Barber makes, but it's just so huge. I can't use it. I can't fit it on my pedal board because they wanted this. So that drum beat became so loud that we had to go to a compact design. So I thought, well, I'll make my first compact design something that uses the LTD sound. It was pretty popular at the time. And in the process of putting this together, I thought, with a couple of toggle switches to kind of make up for the fact that they used to have trim pots on the inside, so I should also mention that. So I used to love the idea of giving the ability for the end user to be able to adjust the sound in the way that I would with a soldering iron and a bunch of parts and changing things out by putting extra controls on the interior that would clutter the top. It would be just too many controls on the top. You'd be hitting it with your foot because you'd have a couple rows of knobs. Now, that's become popular to do that now, and people, I guess, have gotten a lot pointier shoes or more careful feet, something along those lines. I'm not sure. Somebody's giving some sort of tap lesson that's allowing them to do this. So I guess that has become non-pertinent data for making pedals at this point. But nonetheless, I like to have at least 2 inches between the top edge of this foot switch and the knobs because it really reduces the chance of somebody just stomping them on and off like Prince did and messing up their settings. So I realized through using a couple of toggle switches that I could put a gain switch on, so the sound of the unlimited and the sound of the SR would then come together. Through putting a 3-way toggle on, I'd be able to go through the different sounds of the original LTD, the silver, which is kind of flat plus a little bit of extra help in the mid-range area, just a little bit. And I made the EQ knob stronger when we do that now. It's not like the old silver where it's kind of weak because people will tell me it doesn't work.
Right.
And then it's got the SR sound in it. So this allowed me to bring all of those things together and just a whole lot of customer requests into one pedal. It also made it so that when somebody contacted me by phone or by email, they said, I want one of your LTD pedals, but I don't know which one. Do I want the SR? Do I want this? This made it so I didn't have to play sales guy anywhere near as much. And so they're all here in one. So it really helped out a lot with that. And it's become really popular because it's giving you so much because there really is about 4 pedals worth of sounds in this one pedal. And that became kind of my thing. I always liked versatility in audio products, but especially with the compact stuff, I started trying to always focus in, like I told you with the tone press, trying to make it a boost pedal, a compressor, and a parallel compressor in my mind, that I was always giving people at least a couple of pedals for the price that they were paying for it. And I was always trying to make the price that the pedals were for a handmade pedal much lower than the average handmade pedal. Right. And so I was always trying to add a lot of value, hoping that people would see it, and if they talked about it a lot, that would be advertising.
And I think
that's my story.
We missed maybe a key component that we should have got into before we even went into the pedals that you just kind of brought up. Like 2005, 2006, whenever it was that I drove down there, it was $100 pedal.
Yep.
Hand built.
Yep.
In your basement at the time, right?
In my basement at the time, yeah.
Yeah, and so I don't know what your feeling is. I kind of remember you have a feeling on this, on the word boutique, like boutique pedal manufacturer that...
It got used in a way that didn't... it became an advertising word, purely. And so while I might fit the technical definition, from the word go all the way till now, I'm in a garage now that I purpose-built for building pedals. When we moved, I decided, well, I don't need to pay for a separate commercial location. I'm just not that big. And part of that's been... when I had the opportunity to grow more, I didn't go seize it and try to really, the term grow my business, scale this thing or anything like that. I hadn't watched Shark Tank yet, so I didn't know. And then, and also because there's been such a steady flow into the pedal building industry because of how low the bar is for getting into it. There's all these heavy lifter companies that will do so much of the work for you now that really a person that has enough money to order up, 50 or 100 pieces and a place to store them in their house and a method to ship them, they can get into pedal building. It's not very pure. It's not very artistic, but they can. So that's kept us at a size where, we build all the pedals. The only thing that we farm out in the way of work is the enclosure. We used to order the enclosure. I had a metal shop that was within the company that only drilled our enclosures, and then I would take it to a separate powder coater that was about 15 or 20 minutes away, pick them up from there, drive them to the silk screener who put the graphics on there, another 15, 20 minute drive, and bring them back to my place when they were done. And it never worked out that well. It was always separate trips to each and a lot of driving and organizing and all that kind of stuff. But everything was in-house. The board is a board that I designed. The printed circuit board itself, no parts on it. So, and I design those, and then I have a company who makes them in the United States, and they ship them directly to me. We populate, which means to put the parts on it, the board from there, solder the board from there, and then do all of the mechanical assembly of the parts onto the enclosure, and then insert and then solder the board into the enclosure, and then final test everything.
And still do that at a price point that's super, super reasonable. Like when you look at boutique market and what a lot of pedal manufacturers that are building the way you're building, a lot of times have a much higher price point.
Yep. I would expect that. In order to stay in business and do a good quality business and be able to advertise, I think most of them probably should. I probably should, but when you become known for something, you can't just throw that off. I would like to be at, $180 to $200 on all the ones that we just talked about. And most of my friends that are in this industry are, but I can't just go $50 today. Everything goes up $50.
Right.
It's just it would create a period of time where people would say, I don't know, I bet Dave changes his mind. Let's just wait this out 6 months to 9 months.
Right.
And you can't afford 6 to 9 months of no sale. So we had lowered the prices earlier this year on some products, and then the cost of parts coming from China, and you can't get non-Chinese resistors and caps and things like that. It's just really not a thing. There's not a lot of that stuff that you can find made in the United States. So you don't even have a choice in most cases to be able to build these and getting the parts from there. So the prices for those individual parts went up. The enclosures, the aluminum enclosures, are made out of the country. I don't know of a die-cast enclosure manufacturer in the United States that makes this regular format. And if they did, I'm sure it would be more than customers would be willing to pay. So those went up earlier this year, and so when you have that happen, we had to respond and bring prices kind of back up again. But I don't think I'll be doing $99 pedals again. It's just there's no profit. Right. You're really,
but I mean, it's still like the price point is great.
Yep.
So the next pedal unboxing would be the Exacta, and this is your fuzz pedal.
My fuzz pedal, yes.
And I'm sure because we have a couple little toggles. And it's purple, and we need more purple pedals.
We need more purple pedals. And so the Exacta is a repackaging of an earlier pedal that we made that was in the larger enclosure that we discussed earlier, called the Trifecta. So the Trifecta, when we brought that out, I had been making for myself and for some friends, a modification of the Big Muff. Mm-hmm. And one of the main things that it had that people liked about it was there was a control on it. It had 4 knobs. And there was a knob called the sludge control, because that's a cool name to put on a fuzz pedal. And if you got fuzz, you need to have some sludge. So the sludge control allowed you to change and vary the amount of bass that was fed into the initial circuit, so very early on. So one of the reasons a fuzz sounds like a fuzz, and it gets all those kind of less related harmonics that happen that create that really big fat note. But if you try to play anything past a root 5, maybe a root 5-3, it gets pretty, ugly. As soon as you start trying to put any extended chords on it, it's a mess because there's just too many harmonics at once and they're not related very well. So having a lot of bottom pushed through the circuit, but controlling it on a fuzz pedal is one of the things that gives it its fat notes, but fuzzy kind of sound. Almost like when you try to turn up the bass a lot on like a Fender blackface amp and then crank it up, it gets really ugly. It's almost making a fuzz with an amplifier, but even worse controlled. So the sludge control allowed you to dial that back and blur the line between a smooth overdrive and a nasty old, vintage fuzz like a big muff. So you could decide what degree of that you wanted. All the way up, you were just playing a big muff type circuit. As soon as you started dialing it back, now you were feeding less bass into the circuit and controlling that to a taste level that you liked. And it allowed you to get a little bit more complex with your chords if you wanted to. If you wanted to play a dominant 7 or a 13 or something like that, it started to work. And I always like that in pedals that create overdrive or fuzz or anything like that. I like to think that I want the player to be in control of how fancy they can get with their chords and how fat they want the notes to be. The more fatness you put into a note, a lot of times it limits how far you can go with the chords. A lot of people notice that, like with an op-amp based overdrive pedal, so we're all fuzz for a second here, you can often play some pretty extended chords. You can even get a major 7, which doesn't usually work with a cranked up amp. The cranked up amp has a different set of harmonics that allows those notes to sound big and fat. So when you're playing the high E string at the 10th or 12th fret, it doesn't sound pingy, where sometimes on a op-amp based overdrive, it can sound a little pingy. And that becomes your little audio cue that lets you know I'm playing through, a solid state pedal or something like that. So I like to be able to have that line variable when possible, so you can decide how much you're varying between the fat notes and the complex chords and where you land. If you're a pretty simple player that's playing power chords, and wants individual notes to occupy a lot of space, then yeah, that's the right way to go. And so in the fuzz, we did the same thing. So the other feature that made it a trifecta is the concept of 3. So there was 3 different sounds that were all based on vintage big muffs. So there was the standard big muff sound, triangle, and then there was a Vox super tone bender or something like that. I've forgotten which ones we used. And then there was a Sola, and theirs was some sort of a jumbo bender or something like that. And I was just going through schematics of vintage fuzzes that I had compiled over the years, and was like, they're all so similar. A switch could take these different clipping elements and things in and out, and you'd have these 3 different sounds. And the first one is obviously the big muff that Electro Harmonics made, and then the Vox one and then the Super one are obviously them looking at that circuit going, we got to have a version of this. And they make their own version. And so, of course, I'm one of many more guys along the way that nicked the same idea and said, I'm going to do that. And then I had a little switch built into the tone knob that allowed you to push-pull for more of a flat mid-range. So when you take the EQ spectrum of a big muff, and which normally has a big old scoop in the middle of it, lots of thunderous lows, and just tear your tonsils out kind of highs, and you fill that mid-range back in, it actually starts to act and sound more like a very smooth, real and longer sustaining fuzz face, because the fuzz face is a lot flatter in the mid-range in the response, and it doesn't have all that thunder in the lows. So that's pretty neat that you could actually, for a lot of people, a fuzz face with more sustain is a sound that they'll want, and a little bit more controllable too, because a fuzz face, you can't plug any other pedal in before your guitar if you want to have any kind of volume control that makes sense. And they usually get brighter if you change the impedance at the front end with something like a pedal that has a buffer in it or any kind of solid state electronics.
So you can or can't?
That doesn't happen with this. With a big muff, really? And that's just because of the big muff circuit. I didn't do anything to make that happen. With a big muff, you can pretty much plug them in anywhere in the chain. Some people still have their feelings about first in the line, but the first circuit that it hits, in the pedal is pretty accepting of changes in impedance from high to low. It's nothing like a fuzz face at all. A fuzz face, it's got a very low impedance input, and the guitar is very high impedance, so you get a mismatch. And that's part of the sound, is the mismatch. If you plug another pedal in before it, it usually fixes the mismatch and screws up the entire tuning of what a fuzz face sounds. It gets rid of that thick, fat sound to it. It gives it more gain, but it also is bright. That same brightness that you get by fixing the impedance a little bit when you turn your volume knob down with a Strat. Normally you turn your volume knob down with a Strat and you don't have a volume kit on that little capacitor, it gets darker. But with a fuzz face, it gets brighter and you get the Jimi Hendrix clean sound. So this doesn't do that trick. No big muff does. It's not part of the architecture of it. And so on the Exacta, we condensed, because the compact enclosure had to happen, the trifecta, and we went for 2 sounds. So I went for Exacta, because that's more of a description of that, for the name. you've got the flat EQ setting that used to be in the push-pull on one of the settings of the toggle. Then you've got the super tone bender or jumbo bender, something super jumbo for one of the settings. Then you got the big muff. And then you have the sludge control became a sludge switch. So I basically found the three most popular areas. One's all the way up. It's just up running like a vintage big muff at that point. And then the next one up, it cuts back a little bit of the low end going into it. So as you cut back on the low end, one of the things you can do is dial back the tone knob. If it's set up like a big muff is naturally, if you go too far back with the tone knob, the way this EQ works is as you go towards the highs, it swings down the bass. So if you add highs, you're also cutting a lot of bass.
Right.
If you swing and turn the highs down, you just turn the bass up a whole bunch too. And that kind of works for gentle nudges of the knob to get a whole lot done in a hurry. But at the same time, it can make it so that if you want to roll the highs back, but you also don't want all those lows at the same time, you can't do it. So the sludge switch allows you to knock those lows back. You can knock your highs back at the same time and get a really focused sound. Again, more singing, more sweet, especially combined with the flat setting. And you can get a sound where you really are thinking it's fat, it occupies space, but it doesn't have that searing top end. It doesn't have that kind of sputtery bottom to it. And that's a cool sound. Some people want that with fuzz. Sometimes that's the whole reason for getting into it, is all that bleh, my guitar vomiting kind of sound thing. But, you know, sometimes you want something more in between. And so that's, once again, it's trying to make it really a versatile, you know, product to work with for shaping sound.
That's awesome.
And that's what Exacta is.
So, and then the last one you brought, the last unboxing, this is kind of fun. I gotta tell you, like, it's not kind of fun. It's very fun. So the last unboxing, and I'm not familiar with this one.
That makes two of us. Oh, sorry.
Well, then I'm just going to turn that one right over.
You want me to talk about it? I can just make stuff up. I used to live on a street called Linden.
Well, I think that's kind of what it comes from. Linden is from Linden, New Jersey, where a lot of the Ampeg amps were made back in the day. And these are just stories that you hear about the different amp companies and things. So I'd always, heard the stories about Linden, New Jersey, and all the guys wanted the cool amps that were, made there from way back when. And the Linden EQ is what this is. And so a Linden equalizer is meant to give you the EQ spectrum, a back-sandal tone stack that you'd expect from those early Ampeg amps. Primarily a flip-top B15. So the flip-top Portaflex B15 was one of the most famous bass amps, and people really loved it because the EQ could do things as simple as it was. It's just bass and treble that you can't get out of a lot of the new, graphic EQs or parametric EQs or paragraphic, a combination of the two things. When you're trying to do an EQ that's that complex on such a budget, you got a $1,000 amplifier that you need to have 1,200 watts. You need it to be able to handle an input of an active bass like a Music Man, somebody playing slap style, or somebody playing lightly on a jazz bass into the passive input with a passive, pickup. You're already spending a lot of money on the development of that amp, and the direct out that has to be on every bass amp. These days, it has to have a transformer if you want it to be able to, not interfere with ground and things like that. So much money is spent there. By the time they get down to that fancy graphic EQ or parametric EQ, it's not rare for it to be $30 to try to execute an EQ that should cost a lot of money. And so it tends to not really sound good. It gives the appearance of lots control. It makes you buy it. You can make things move a lot, but it sounds less natural. As soon as you start bending the EQ on those amps, a lot of times it's like, yeah, I have highs, but man, I have a lot of frets. And I wanted those highs, I wanted that articulation, but I didn't want all those frets. And if you bring the bottom up, really common with those is you get more lows, but you get a lack of distinction. It almost kind of yawns in the bottom. Instead of you playing these punchy lines that are you get this kind of mushy kind of bottom sound to it. Even though the B15 was a low wattage tube amp for bass, it was always known for, if you push the bass, you get more bass, but it stays tight. And so that's how the Linden EQ works for bass. You plug this in the front end of a guitar amp or go direct to a console with it, like use this and then plug it into a direct box or any kind of a line in, or like a mic preamp or something like that. It works as a full bass rig at that point. You can even plug this directly into a power amp. And as long as the power amp is about 2 volts sensitive to go to maximum output, this can provide the correct output, that you can use this as a preamp. You don't even need a preamp. You can just have your bass, this pedal, the Linden EQ, a power amp, and your speakers. Wow. So the controls right around center are flat, but the B15 wasn't perfectly flat there. So really it's bass up a little bit from flat and treble back a little bit from flat is probably more like where the flat range is. When you push the treble knob, it's a similar kind of story. When you push the treble on a B15, that EQ circuit will allow you to get highs and a lot of articulation, but you don't get a lot of frets. It's smooth, it's sweet. And so this stays very smooth and sweet like that. And the bass is the same way. When you're changing that, you're keeping all that articulation, but you're really getting aggressive with the bottom end. And so then to make that further augmented and try to stick with this, always trying to make things as versatile as possible. You've got one control that will give you new settings. So it's a 3-way toggle over here. And that gives you sounds that work a little bit better for modern techniques. The B15 was developed at a time where it was developed for an accordion, So, even though they were thinking, okay, a bass player can plug into it too, but we know that's going to be a fad. They didn't believe that was going to...
Accordions forever.
Keep going. That's really was their Ampeg's motto from what everybody says. And so this gives you 2 more EQ ranges where the mid dips a little bit more. And so for more aggressive modern styles, it allows you to get to those sounds. So you're not simply locked in the past with the sound of the EQ. And then the toggle switch on the right gives you different levels of those bright inputs that were on those old Ampeg amps. Because a lot of bass players like to plug into the bright input and then crank the bass, making it really tight and aggressive because they're chopping out the deepest lows that can tend to make the speaker say too much information, or that low wattage power amp say too much information. The same thing can still happen with a 1200 watt today. It still can feel like too much information to the speaker or even to the cabinet. The cabinet can have funny resonances in certain frequencies. So with that control, you can limit a little bit of the bottom and then get more aggressive with the bass knob if you want to. So we got 3 different steps. We've got just the stock one, we've got the bright setting from the old stock amps, and then we have an in-between that kind of averages the difference. And that one tends to be where most people work. It's just a matter of looking at it in a little bit more modern way and also thinking about the application where it'll either be direct to a console, direct to somebody's bass amp, maybe even plugged into an effect return or a power amp return on their amp that they've decided, I like the power of this, big corporation amplifier, but I'm not a fan of the whole preamp section. The power amp's great. I have all the power amp I need, but I want something different. And there's a lot of guys that use them that way. So Linden EQ.
Wow. Very cool.
And it sounds great on guitar for all the same basic reasons. So you can put the sparkly highs back into that small amp and bring a little bit of lows into it and make your guitar work better at a low volume with that. So
cool.
It's a cool product for guitar and bass, really.
So, as the self-proclaimed kindergartner in this wonderful operation, I'm going to have to ask the beard to hit the pause button because my brain is on overload. I feel like I've been drinking from a fire hose, listening to a guy that is incredibly passionate and gifted at what he does. But I think we all kind of need to kind of step back, have a little sorbet, and get ready for the next course because there's a lot going on in that first episode.
So thank you so much for joining us for part 1. Be on the lookout for part 2 coming soon. Please subscribe, hit the like button, click notifications to find out when part 2 is coming out. You will notice we didn't play any of David's pedals while he was here, but he's left some with us and we're going to go through those pedals. So again, hit notifications to find out when that happens. And there's even a possibility of in the future getting together with David again. So if you like what you're seeing in the interviews and all the other stuff we're doing, check out some of the other stuff, the Leslie series and other pedals that we've reviewed. Again, hit the like button. But with that,
I'm PJ on behalf of the beard reminding you, no matter what you hear, you never have too much gear.